live. It is Neil Atkinson coming up. We've got Callum Jacobs. Very much looking forward to that. It's a pleasure to have done Callum about his book, and there's more on that book coming out on the Anfield Wrap across next week. I had a very, very long chat with him about it, and I would recommend that as being worth listening to. Also coming up is our season reviews across the board. We've also got Harriet Pryor, with a man who's running all the marathons that is to come too. But we will do our season reviews in the order of Mo Stewart first, me second, Neil Docking third, and then Mike Bankole fourth. They are all joining me for this one. So you've got the inserts to come, but we're not going to mess around. We're going to include people's chat if we need to as we go through. But what I want is for you to discuss the season in your own way, any way you want. It's your call as to how you're going to go about it. We will go to Mo Stewart first. And Mo, the floor is indeed yours.
Thank you, Neil. It might surprise some people that I was so keen to jump in, but I have actually had some time away to think and digest how I feel about last season. So it probably does me some good to go first. I think about how last season ended in Paris. And yes, obviously the game and the fallout afterwards was a bad ending, but there was it was a build-up of joy right up until that point for most of the second half of the season. And this season ended with me basically on a flight to Chicago in the air, not watching the game and feeling quite happy about the fact that I wasn't watching the game and that Liverpool FC in this entirety was falling down my priority list for at least the next week or so. I mean, it ended up being 3 days, but that's by the by. But that kind of sums up how this season's gone in the whole. It's been a disappointing one, but this was the bad year that reminds you what the good years look like. That's the way I kind of feel about it, because you kind of need to have both to really fully appreciate one. And there will be lots of people now who've said that they saw this coming, and to a certain extent, a lot of people did see it coming, but most of those are people who predict disaster at every turn. So the law of averages dictate they're going to be right sometime. But I feel like really going back and putting myself in that mindset where we were at the beginning of the season, there were a couple of big red herrings for me that kind of masked what we now saw. Klopp himself being so bullish with you, Neil, about what we did and didn't need. I think that really resonated with me at the time. That bloody Community Shield, where we absolutely handed Man City their ass and looked like, oh, wow, this is going to be the team. Nunes got his goal, Trent scored, all the things I was hoping for all happened. But then it all turned really, really quickly. I remember walking out of Palace at home, first home game, 2 draws, first 2 games, chatting to Robbo. And it was all about the brilliance of Diaz and the struggles of Nunes. And I remember kind of saying to him, well, hopefully we're only talking about one of these by the end of the season. And we were, but it was the wrong one. And again, that is a kind of as a microcosm of the way the season went. There was optimism, there was hope, but it was quickly dashed by reality. And it was a lot of things that we had to deal with, that a lot of other teams had to deal with, that we didn't deal with anywhere near as well for a multitude of reasons. I think the World Cup being the biggest, most obvious one, I just, again, tried to put myself in the mindset of where we were going into that. We were desperate for that World Cup break to save us. So that was going to be what changed the season around. And it made it worse. It made it actually worse. And I remember that feeling of despair of thinking, shit, maybe they aren't coming back. Maybe this is the end. And yes, to a certain extent, they did come back. And they went from being unserious and unreliable to once again looking like the team that we know and love. And you can say that maybe that makes it harder, the fact that in the end we made it so close, and maybe it would hurt less if we'd have just ended up like Spurs, completely rudderless. But I don't buy that. I wanted to see that we were there, and I think it's important for the road back that we see that we were there. It's a lot easier from here than it is from where Tottenham are. But it does sting that we were that close, that if you look at it, even after everything, we beat Villa and we hand Southampton their ass, and we're there. Like, we literally still could be there. We were only 4 points behind Newcastle at the end of the final shake. So you think, could we have got ourselves together quicker? Like, I wonder what happens in a world where Gareth Southgate doesn't pick Trent and Klopp has him, Andy Robertson, Bajcetic and Joe Gomez the whole break to work on this new thing that we ended up with. I wonder what happens in that scenario. We'll never know. But I do think there are lots of people who will need to assess how they went about things this season, coaching staff, management and players. and hope to do things differently. But there is optimism that can happen. I think I've ended with probably more optimism than I'd had at any point since that very beginning.
Okay, so what is your primary driver for the optimism, Mo? Is it just the way in which the results have gone in the end, or is it that you want to be optimistic? What's the primary driver?
I mean, that naturally I always am optimistic. I do try to find joy in life. I do think it's important to believe that's kind of what we're in it for. But there is some hard evidence to that. I do think, obviously, this new system does seem to have been the driver for our change in fortunes towards the end of the season. And there is potential from the platform we've given to build on it through the transfer market, through another pre-season of bedding in these tactics. So there is a road to an evolution of the team that can see us return. I do think as well that there is scope for improvement within the players we've already got. It's not all going to be just players coming in. But I do think one of our best things in the history of the club era is being able to know when we fucked it up. And I think the fact that we're bringing in someone new to deal with the transfers tells me that we're in a situation where we know what has gone before can't continue for whatever reason. And I think that we have the ability to look within ourselves and find a new way.
Okay. Anyone else on anything that Mo said there? Neil, Mike? Go on, Mike.
Just on your point on optimism, and I know you, Mo, you're an optimistic guy in general. So it's been a tough season for all of us, but are there any spells in the season, apart from maybe the back end of it, that you can look back on and think of in any way positively? Like, are there any things or any players' performances that you look back on this season and think, okay, there's something that we can actually really build on for next season?
The biggest one for me is Cody Gakpo. I think Cody Gakpo, not only the manner of the signing, how it came from nowhere, and the fact that it was one of those where lots of us didn't really quite see the logic, and then it turned out to be they had a different plan for him all along, and lo and behold, that plan seems to have worked. That part of the Liverpool ethos is still alive and kicking, and I think that was a really important part of our first resurgence. And if we still have the ability to do that, then we're going to need it.
At one stage, Mo, it looked like we weren't going to get European football at all. And yeah. I hosted a show. We had a good old ding-dong with Kev Walsh about whether or not we want to be in Europe. Are you still of the view now that we've qualified for the Europa League, that that's something, again, to be optimistic about?
Definitely. I do. I think that the way that our squad will probably be situated in terms of having new players to come in and bed in, and younger players or players who are still got some improvements to make, having games that are maybe not quite as much of a tightrope. So Champions League game, I think you have to always be at as close to 100% intensity as you can, even for some of the smaller teams. I think you can maybe drop that about 10, 15%, maybe even 20 or 30, depending on who we draw in the Europa League. And just that extra bit of space to be able to get yourselves together, to be able to bed into what needs to be done, I think will be quite vital. I do think as well, we're going to still need to have a big squad to kind of mitigate some of the injury issues that I don't see going away just with the click of a finger. We've been unlucky, but we can't say that we're just not going to have any injuries, because that is the exception rather than the rule. So we're going to need a bigger squad, and ergo, you're going to need games to give those squad. And I think having European games is going to be important. I buy that there might be some issues with the timetable, particularly if we end up having to play a team in Kazakhstan at like 3 PM on a Thursday. But I do think overall the good outweighs the bad.
Okay. All right. First and foremost, then I'll do mine, and then we can go from there. I find the season a little bit difficult to talk about on the whole, because going all the way back to the first thing about it is that it just all comes far too quickly. Everything that happens after the back end of last season, the way in which it finishes, specifically with the events around Paris, just sort of leave me, when I try to sort of recollect everything, just in a little bit of a daze. It's actually been quite difficult planning what we're doing this June in the Anfield Wrap, because I cannot remember what we did last June other than talk about Paris. And I can't remember any of those major events. I can remember being in Glastonbury, and then from there I feel as though basically Paris happened, did loads of media, woke up, did Glastonbury, woke up, and I was on stage in London on the 9th of July prior to the start of the season with you, Mo, and doing that event. And then from there, and I think Mike was in attendance as well. And then from there, going off onto pre-season. On the pre-season stuff, I thought they looked really sharp in the pre-season training that we saw, and obviously get whacked by Manchester United. But at that point, it wasn't something to be concerned about. There was, I think, that for me, a lot of the conversation around the season is a conversation around the uses of optimism. So it's interesting that Mo ended sort of talking about optimism. I sort of start talking about optimism, and I think that a lot of what this manager's done really well. You know, if we go from his very first press conference, he talks about turning doubters into believers. And he's very much used that power all the way through his tenure as Liverpool manager. And I think he is first and foremost an optimistic character, but I think he's also a character who wants to enjoy every moment, every last moment that is available, and wants that to be spread around as much as possible. And I think that optimism has served Liverpool, I think, really, really well. There'll be some people who don't agree with that, who would feel as though if he was at times a little bit more grounded, not just in the season just gone, but maybe in 3 or 4 of the ones that have preceded it, Liverpool could have won more silverware. And I feel as though there's something else that actually happens during last season, which isn't just as simple as a conversation around where the players were physically or mentally. But I think that a lot of the optimism and that sort of enjoyment the manager talks about began to ebb away during the last campaign. I think it was eroded, even though Liverpool were going for all 4 trophies. I think it was being eroded by the behemoth that we have to go up against then. And that's something that I think I've only entirely understood through the run into this season, being exposed to it in a third-hand way through what's happened with Arsenal, going up against Manchester City in the way in which that goes. But I think that has had an impact on the fan base, and that makes me really sad, first and foremost, because the purpose of this is to enjoy it. I say it is a leisure activity. I've said that before, and I'll say it again. And it feels a little bit as though those bits have been sort of lost. But then also because it is the defeat of optimism throughout the very start of the season, arguably the run all the way through until the World Cup, because ultimately the players that the manager was being optimistic about, for a wide variety of different reasons, some of which are conventional injury or injury-prone footballers. Others are the madness of whatever it is that's happened with Curtis Jones. Some of that is backing Harvey Elliott at a point where I think he should have backed him up with another footballer, but he very much didn't think that and optimistically backed Harvey, as he had done at the start of the previous season. It's worth pointing out. And I think in the long term of the campaign, that was possibly to Harvey's detriment, but hopefully not to the long term of his career. And then also the legs of whom he was asking to go one more round, one more season. The optimism that he had around that, I think, ebbed away. I think the margins are smaller than people give it credit for. I don't think Liverpool would have won the league by any stretch of the imagination or even challenged for it if Henderson's shot last minute against Fulham had hit the underside of the bar and gone over the line. But I think that Liverpool would then have had a different attitude and approach going into the game against Crystal Palace. Would have been more resilient then for the game that was coming up against Manchester United. As it is, by the time Liverpool come out the other side of that result against Napoli, which is the cancelled fixtures because of the death of the Queen as well. You know, Liverpool play that game against Napoli and don't play another league game until the 1st of October. I think that optimism had sort of begun to wane, and that Liverpool really felt genuinely very, very vulnerable in a number of ways, physically and mentally, and that was to sort of mark out the rest of the campaign. There's still odd splashes in there. That mad game at Arsenal, where, again, optimism is the problem. They concede the goal just before half-time because they've decided they're definitely going to score one, and everybody who's ever played for Liverpool goes and plays up front. Phil Neal was up front somehow at that moment. And the manager post-match in his comments blames himself for that. He's on the sidelines and he blames himself, saying, yeah, because they thought they were going to score and I thought they were going to score. And that's, again, it's this idea of we back the most positive outcome. It's going to go our way. And then it emphatically doesn't, and they end up going 2-1 down in a half where they've been the better side for 44 minutes in the middle of the first goal and the Arsenal second goal. And they find themselves, a reverse in that fixture, and they never really recover from the goal that they concede, just before half time. optimism like Virgil away at the City ground for Forest, choosing to nod it back across goal because there'll definitely be a Liverpool player there to tap it home rather than just nodding it past the goalkeeper at that point. Even though that would have been less percentage, he was still taking the optimistic course. We'll be able to sort this out and go from there. And I think that just sort of remains a little bit of a problem. Liverpool can't get the balance right all the way through the campaign. They go into modes of playing quite pessimistically, but they manage to make a complete mess of that as well. And then they think, all right, we've got to try and be a bit more front foot and we'll sort that out. And then there's like mad things where, there's a lot of odd results all the way through the season for every team. But one of the oddest is this Liverpool team manages to get its act together to, for instance, not just sort of go to St. James's Park for a half 5 kickoff when it feels as though a defeat would have been the end of any Champions League hopes, but they go 2-0 up and get a lad sent off in 25 minutes. So, of course, you sort of believe in this because you keep getting reasons to believe. And everything the manager's ever done has been like, so we build on that belief. And then the next game after that, they play Real Madrid at home and they go 2-0 up. And then it's the ultimate death of optimism because they then concede 5 goals in about 35 minutes, one of which is just an absolute gift from the goalkeeper. So then they go to Palace and they play like absolute misery gutsers when there was a game there to be won because they can't quite get the balance right. And then 2 games later, they put 7 past Manchester United. And then they go to Bournemouth and act like they're going to obviously absolutely whack them and dominate them for 20 minutes. And then one thing goes wrong and they go, oh God, we're all rubbish. And all the way through the season, I think because so much of this is built on optimism and on this idea of this enjoyment. And it's not like it ever gets to the point where you need to be genuinely, unbelievably miserable. So in between the results against Nottingham Forest and Leeds, which I think are the 2 worst results of the season and the 2 defining results of the season, they go to Ajax and win 3-0. They go to Ajax and win 3-0, and then they bounce back after the Leeds defeat and beat Napoli, who'd smashed them before 2-0, and then they go to Tottenham and win 2-1. So because there's worse runs under Klopp, there have been worse runs under Klopp than any run that there is at any given time this season. There's been worse runs of Liverpool sides you've seen in the past by some distance than any point you've seen this season, but they never become truly abject in a way which says we've got to save the day until possibly they have to gird the loins because they're 2-0 down at home to Arsenal. And then that gets them going with a new thing. And ultimately my answer to this is that I don't want the optimism to stop. And in fact, if anything, I want it to come back. I don't want the enjoyment to stop. I want the enjoyment to come back. I think a season where for the first 10 games, Manchester City's results are none of our business is the most important thing we can do next season. We've got to kick off and not even think about what Manchester City are doing because we only play them twice. So we've just got to do our thing. And there's 36 other games that we can have a real confidence we can win. But we don't have to kick off like we're 1-0 down, which is part of what the optimism led to because we felt we could go toe-to-toe with this behemoth. We kick off 1-0 down. So that's my one. I need that to stop. And I think we've got to get back to the sheer joyous enjoyment of it. And that's what I think we do during the Arsenal game and then in that run-in, even including the madness of what happens at Southampton. I think we need to have a bit of that certainly across the start of next season and go from there. Has anyone got any questions? I went longer than I told you all to go. Sorry.
A lot of what you've talked about there speaks to me about the mindset and the mentality not being right, from one week to the next. And also you talked about, the issues. I've often thought about this. We go to Fulham, nearly could have won on the opening day. But teams have mixed bag of an opening day. That's not an uncommon occurrence. Then, a red card and we struggle with a draw against Palace. But it felt after 2 games already so desperate. And for such an experienced group of players and with, and leaders as well, managers, coaching staff, why do you think that
Manchester City?
Yeah, is that purely it? That they just made everything feel so desperate so quickly?
I think they dropped points in the first 2 games and they went, well, we're not going to win the league with this lot. And I think there is a problem, and I've heard this said in the past about other players, going back sort of 10, 15 years. Like, for instance, Gerrard is better in the 08-09 season and arguably the 13-14 season than seasons where Liverpool are just going for 4th. Because if you've been there, you can raise yourself to want to be there, or if it's something you've not done before. But if it just becomes a bit of a trudge, and I think ultimately they need to, if I have got a criticism of all of them, and I do include the manager, and I don't think the manager had a good season at all. I don't think he's had a good season at all. I think he's got a lot wrong. And I think in that context, I think he's sort of got it game by game wrong. It's not, I think he's not entirely got to grips with what he's doing with the 5 subs at times. I think there's been other bits and pieces through the campaign. I think he's began to sort of second guess himself and misread the moments. But I ultimately think, because they know they're going up against Manchester City, it's not just the idea of not winning in the first 2. It's the idea that Fulham away and Palace at home are exactly the sort of games you need to be winning if you're going to win this league. And I think they just do their own heads in, and then they go to United in the crap, and they're actually all right second half at United. They almost get their act together again in this sort of weird thing that they keep going through. But they're still awful until they go 2-0 down, and then they sort of right themselves a little bit. And I just think they've had their heads burnt out, and that's what I think. Go on, Mo.
The other thing you got to put into the mix of that is Haaland, because he instantly changed who they were, and for all of the outside noise of people saying, "Oh, well, maybe he's not going to make them as good," players know players. They know how good he was.
Yeah.
They knew he was going to make them better.
They played against him.
I think there's that, but I think there's something else in that as well, Mo. And this isn't a criticism of Nunez, and I think Nunez will be better than fine for Liverpool next season. But I think that one of the things they then looked around their own dressing room and went, "Christ, I wish we had a couple of new boys."
Exactly.
And that aspect of that, as much as anything else, I think sort of does them in as well.
Definitely.
Here's a question, Neil, on the City point, because we're obviously recording this before they play United in the Cup final, and obviously before they play Inter Milan in the Champions League final. And there's every chance they win the treble, right? Yeah. And that's only going to add to their aura as a side. So they are already a side that won 5 league titles in 6. They are the side to beat. Everyone knows this now. How do you think that affects us as a camp? Is it as simple as us adding some, you add a Thuram, a Kone, all these fresh players, and we get this new lease of life and we are able to enjoy it again? Or does City win the treble actually add more pressure? It's like, oh my gosh, these guys are just unstoppable.
No, I don't think it adds more pressure, because I think the pressure couldn't be any greater, because it's all about one thing, which is going and winning the league. I think that the freshness of new footballers around, who, by the way, haven't lived 5-6 years of this, is no bad thing. And that they bounce in and they're almost a bit like, yeah, that's fine, we know about that, but we'll sort that out in time. That can't run forever, because nothing goes forever in football. So I think an element of that's no bad thing. But I think also the pressure cannot be any greater. And I think in a sense, the idea of coming from 5th to make a run of the whole thing, then I think that I think that the idea of, I can't wait for the fixtures to come out, not least because there's a really nice opening run that Liverpool could maybe sort of do with having. And it's not the obvious things. Like, for instance, there's nothing wrong with them having Tottenham away first 3 games and stuff, going somewhere that's meant to be theoretically tough, but going and getting something out of it and feeling like a bit of cohesion and togetherness. So, yeah, that's my sort of thing on that. I don't think the City... And also, if City do the treble, there's almost a part of everyone which is almost a bit like, well, that's out the way now. That's done. You know what I mean? This thing that you've got in your head. If they just do it, then it's done. And then that's what we're up against. And now everyone knows what we're up against. And I think almost also the shared thing with Arsenal and everyone talking about all the bits and pieces of it all, I think it helps us, and I think it takes the pressure off. Anything else? Okay. This is TAW Live. We will go over now for our inserts, as discussed earlier on. Callum and JP talking to Harriet. JP with Harriet first, and Callum with me talking about his book, A New Formation. That is part 1 of TAW Live. Immediately at the start of part 2 will be Neil Docking. And we're back, and we've got Neil Docking. Neil, what is your season review?
Well, I think I'm bitterly disappointed, as is everyone, with the way the season's transpired. But I also feel very conflicted about how I feel about the set of players, the manager, and the group, really, because they're all legends. They've all won everything for us. They've achieved everything for us. They are players that I'll talk about in 20 years' time, 30 years' time. The stories will always be told of this group of players. And I have immense sympathy for them on the one hand, going up against this juggernaut of Man City, this financial powerhouse with charges of 115 alleged financial breaches against them. With all their quality, all their resources, their great manager, just coming up short in the league, and how damaging psychologically that must have been. And also in Paris, the events both on and off the pitch affecting the players and their families as they were affected. And, a Courtois-inspired Madrid beat us on the day when I think we were the better side. Very hard to stomach. I've mentioned on previous shows the similarity with 14-15 and the hangover from not getting over the line the year before. A star player leaving, Suarez then, Mane now, new players coming in who some would go on to be good players but hadn't settled yet, and signings being made, signings that weren't made. So I have a lot of sympathy for them. The season starts with a couple of really frustrating draws, and I understand the view that their heads were just kettled straight away. They're not going to win the league. These are players who are used to winning, competing at the highest level, and they realised very quickly that the title is going to be none of their business. Haaland scoring hat-tricks every week, and we're struggling. So I have a lot of sympathy on that hand. But on the other hand, I still have a lot of anger. They infuriated me like very few Liverpool teams have. There were times where I hated the bones of all of them. Case in point, the 3rd game away at Man United. Eric Ten Hag's reign has got off to a disastrous start. They've lost 2 games in a row, lost at home to Brighton, been spanked 4-0 away at Brentford. If we go there and beat them again, he's in a crisis 3 games into his Man United career. And instead, we gave him the platform. We gave him the launch pad for his reign by beating us at home. It was colossal for them. And we just didn't show up. We weren't doing basic things. The captain not pulling someone down on the halfway line on the counter. Experienced players making just mind-numbing mistakes. And then time and time again, we'd have a performance that was more akin to what we're used to from this set of players. And then the following week, you wouldn't even recognize them. They weren't showing for each other. They weren't covering each other's backs. They were pointing the finger. It was like the blame game every week. But then again, there's so many injuries and it's a new way of playing. And because of City, we've had to adapt the way we play to try and achieve perfection, to try and achieve the impossible, rather than perhaps sticking with the tried and trusted formula that got us to the mountaintop. We're constantly seeking to evolve to play keep up with this juggernaut. So I keep on switching between, on the one hand, hating them, and on the other hand, saying, I understand, lads, it's not fair. We're all in this together, and it's not fair. And that's just the way it's been, really. That's how it was all season. But there came a stage where I felt like we'd lost. I don't know if you lost me then. Sorry if I was still talking away. It came a stage then where I felt like we just lost our identity. I was just looking at us. I was thinking, I just don't understand. This is so far removed from a Klopp team. We're not pressing. We're not making life difficult for the opposition. We're letting them play through us. We're letting the opposition expose all of our weaknesses, all of our sort of tightrope that we walk, the high-risk strategy. We were making it worse for ourselves by not providing that cover. And I have to say, in the midst of all that, it goes back to the fury and being annoyed, incredibly annoyed at FSG, incredibly annoyed at Jurgen for not kicking up more of a fuss, for mistakes that have been made in the past being repeated. We'd wasted one season. Our greatest manager of my time supporting Liverpool, we wasted the season after we won the league. We made catastrophic errors, in my opinion, not replacing Dejan Lovren, going into the season with not enough centre-halves and knowing that there was injury-prone players amongst them in Gomez and Matip. And this season, I'd called out long last season that I thought Gini should have been replaced. I didn't think we had enough control in midfield. We weren't able to have a quiet 10 minutes. We weren't able to absorb pressure like we had previously. And of course, the turn of the year, we just started winning every week and winning loads of trophies. And then we really nearly win the quadruple. So pretty soon I shut up moaning about not replacing Gini because I was making me look like an idiot. But the issue still remained. And when he was saying we had enough options in midfield, it was patently obvious we didn't. Even though Keita and Thiago had good seasons by their standards injury-wise, with both an injuries just around the corner. We knew Fabinho had struggled towards the end of the year. We know Henderson's a year older. Milner's a year older. That squad needed freshening up. And again, Klopp was saying it didn't. The money wasn't there. It felt like money that should be there. There's a big debate, obviously, to have about the way, some decisions that have been taken in terms of funding the developments of the stands and the training ground, the money that's not available for transfers. I feel like the manager needed backing in the summer and backing significantly to go again. He wasn't, and we've wasted another year under the greatest manager of my lifetime. I find that incredibly frustrating. And that goes back to the point with the players. I'm sure the players come September, October, we're thinking we've wasted a year. We've wasted a year when we're in serious business. I'm sure Mo Salah is looking around thinking, I'm the business. These lads around me are the business. And we're nowhere near winning the trophies we should be in contention for. So the reset of the World Cup obviously didn't come. Things got even worse after Christmas. It just felt like we were just staring into an abyss when we were playing Wolves every week and losing every week. It felt on the road, shipping 3 goals here, there, and everywhere. I just didn't even know what team I was watching. But then amongst that, I look back at some of the nights and some of the times I've had with some of the people on this podcast and with my friends and, my dad going the match. I look at the Newcastle win, the last minute winner and the guttural release of that when they tried to, cheat their way to victory with every trick in the book, wasting down the clock. And then the 97th minute winner. I think of one of the greatest days of my life being in that ground where we put 7 past Manchester United, the famous Manchester United, come to Anfield and get taken to the cleaners like never before. Just standing next to my dad, looking at the scoreboard, just hugging him over and over. Like, how good is this? That Gakpo goal, just replaying that Gakpo goal over and over on my phone on the train home through bleary, drunken eyes, just thinking, this is magic. This is Liverpool. And then we go and lose at Bournemouth. Oh, they've driven me mad like never before. Even in the Madrid, the madness of the Madrid tie, where for 20 minutes you think you're watching Jurgen Klopp's Liverpool, but again, we can't have a quiet 10. We can't see out any period. And the optimism of the wins, the runs at the end, we didn't deserve top 4. We didn't get it. But we did put a lot right. I still have a lot of concerns about the new system, whether we're defensively solid enough to really hit the targets we want to next season. So much work needs doing. I look at the squad and most of the players, there's question marks of one kind or another against. It's a huge summer for the club, a huge summer. And I just really want us to see us go out, get the targets Jurgen wants, and just give this manager every opportunity to get us back in contention next season, because I believe he can. It just needs freshening up, and we need to go into it collectively with the optimism that this is a blank canvas, a fresh start, a clean slate, whatever other metaphor you can think of.
Well, we can take any of them. In the comments, someone said sympathy why these guys lost to Brighton, Bournemouth, Wolves, Forest and Brentford with some diabolical performances. That those results and performances on the road were infuriating, Neil. But for me, anyway, the sympathy was just always still there, in part because of what they'd achieved before, but also in part because I just felt a little bit like, in some of those games, 1 or 2 of them you look at after the fact and you think, well, they played quite well, or 1 or 2, like for instance, Salah, I think whose level I don't think becomes ever that bad over the course of the season, but he's the one who misses the penalty away at Bournemouth. A penalty you never thought he was going to score on the telly, if we're all honest. Any of us thought he was going to score. So I end up being sympathetic, if you see what I mean, because to not be would be to say that everything that they'd either achieved before or what they actually were as footballers was not quite there. How did you feel?
Well, yeah, I mean, they've won it all. They've been to the well for us time and time again. They've pushed themselves to the absolute limits. 2 cup finals, domestic cup finals to extra time and penalties. Every possible game they could have played last season until the very last second, we had the chance of winning the lot. These are players who've played, the ultra competitive, ultra pressing, the graft they've put in for Klopp and his way of playing football over year after year after year. Some of these older players who've struggled, your Fabinho and your Hendersons, they couldn't have more credit in the bank and they couldn't have more miles in their legs. And there was times where I was watching them and I could see them with, not to pick on Harvey Elliott, but young players like Harvey Elliott, like Carvalho, being thrown into the midst at games like Forest. And I was thinking, these players, they shouldn't be relying on youngsters to do their running for them and to carry, do the hard yards for them. There should be fresh blood alongside them. So a sympathy in that respect, and sympathy just because sometimes things just go wrong. Bajcetic comes in and plays really well, and then he gets a season-ending injury. Luis Diaz doesn't look like a player to me who I ever thought was going to be injury-prone. He's an absolute warrior. But he gets a horrendous injury, and then the injury is worsened during the World Cup, and he's out for even longer. So much went wrong. The injury crisis at the start of the season, it's a long time ago now, but how many players were injured at the start of the year? Whatever could go wrong did go wrong. You've used the phrase often, they eroded themselves, they eroded each other. Were bad performances, they erode against, and then you get another bad performance and you almost spiral, don't you? I have to say, I'm amazed that they pulled it out to the extent they did in the running and put together that run. I mean, it still shows there's still a lot they're burning in terms of their hunger, their desire, and the quality that's in the squad. Quality teams don't get some of the results we've posted. Sorry, terrible teams don't get some of the results we've posted this year. So that gives me optimism, and yeah, I do have sympathy for them. Much as I hated their guts. On many occasions, don't get me wrong.
I was at Brighton, and my God, I've rarely hated a football team as much. Mo, anything for Neil?
It's really strange the way you've kind of been flipping between it, because I've been thinking about that a lot as well. And for me, it's kind of like the difference between what is an excuse and what is a reason. And I think a lot of the time people get the two conflated, when the reality is that an excuse is not necessarily the same, whereas a reason is literally why something happened. So if I dropped an egg on your head, the reason you got egg on your face is because I dropped it. But the excuse would be if I was to say, hey, Duck, I'm about to drop an egg, and then I'll still drop the egg on your head. You'd be like, oh, well, maybe there's an excuse. You had an opportunity to get out of the way. And these things are very different. And that how I assess how I feel about the team kind of does change within those. So I think all of the injuries are a really good example. That is a reason. Like, there are reasons why with better players available at certain times, certain results would have been different. I think we can say that now looking across the course of the season. Obviously, that's the same for a lot of teams. So this is something that we dealt with worse than other people. And I do think that in terms of the sympathy for them, for what they're going through, and the human element of it in particular, when we think about the hangover from last season, that can't be discounted. I do have slightly less sympathy in terms of them thinking, oh, well, the season's gone too soon. I know it's a natural thing, but you need to be able to get over it. And I don't think they did. And
No.
some of the malaise that we saw over the course of the season, particularly some of the disharmony that we saw, that I don't even really think in 2 seasons ago when we were in a bit of a malaise, I don't really think there was disharmony to that level in terms of the players getting at each other and those kind of things. And some of the processes that we normally rely on to get us out of these trouble weren't working for long periods of time. And that was the part where I was a little bit less sympathetic. But the way I do it is my sympathy is I back them to be able to put it right. That's kind of where the credit that they've got in the bank, that's kind of where it lies for me. Rather than absolving them from the problem, I think it's more giving them the opportunity to set it right.
Yeah, I agree with everything you've said there. I have to say there were many occasions where I was very frustrated with some of our senior players and some of them not rising to the challenge. It's certainly Van Dijk, Henderson, Fabinho. I just think at times they were just nowhere near the level we've come to expect from them. And as our most experienced players and the leaders in the dressing room, I felt like we just didn't see enough from them. And I really think that they themselves, they can, there's obviously issues around the squad and who hasn't come in and injuries, but I think they would look at themselves and I think they would honestly say, have they given a good account of themselves over the last season? And they'd say, no, they haven't. And they know they need to be better. So that's another factor. But then again, they've played 1,000 games, including a World Cup. And, so much, they've put so much into their efforts over the last year. But I do think that with, new signings and freshening up the squad, that we can go again.
Okay. Mike, it is your turn. Give us your review of the season.
Yeah, so I guess it's a tough one to analyze this season because it's just been so weird. It feels like the longest season ever. It feels like it's been going on for about 10 years, to be honest with you. Like you, Neil, it came too soon for me. I wasn't in Paris, but I knew people who were in Paris, and I found it really tough after that, knowing what people went through, hearing all the stories, and the game almost became irrelevant afterwards and what happened in the game. Obviously, I was disappointed that we lost the Champions League final, and I felt like that team deserved another big one. But it was a real shame that what happened in Paris, and the season just comes a bit too quickly for me. So yeah, I don't know. I just find it hard to analyze. But I think it's been a season where we both haven't made our luck. So I don't think we did enough to prepare for the type of season we wanted to have. But then we've also had hard lines. So I think in the summer I was doing shows with you, and I said I wanted a midfielder in. And I really wanted a dynamic midfielder in that could, had legs, that could cover ground, that could, add some of the things we lost from Wijnaldum and other midfielders we lost in the past. And we didn't do that this summer, last summer. We didn't do that. And the manager was actually really bullish about his options. I mean, he did the interview with you, Neil, where he says, what type of midfielder do I need? He's very confident about the midfielders he has. So you're thinking, okay, he's confident. I trust the manager. And ultimately, his confidence was misplaced because, he banked on players that have, injury records that are questionable to say the least. Keita, Chamberlain, and even when players were available, like Jones at times, he overlooked some of these players until it was almost too late. The season was kind of gone. So it's a weird season to analyze. I think there have been so many false dawns this season as well. There are so many times when you think they're almost going to do it. They're almost going to go on that run you want them to go on to. So, I think of after the Bournemouth game, the 9-0, and it was a weird game because you don't win 9-0 often, but I felt like one of those is like, okay, we really whacked aside, now let's go on a run. And it felt like one of those. And then after that, we had this another setback. And just so many times this season where you think they're going to recover and you think they're going to show signs of life, it just never kind of, means anything. Up until the last, 10 games this season where we go on that big run and we have a good time. I feel like that's the only part of the season where I really enjoyed myself. I always thought top 4 was going to be beyond our reach in that spell, but I was having fun seeing this side show something new, enjoy playing with each other. I guess the big concern for me this season has just been the lack of collective identity. And last season, when I did my review, I focused on how much I loved being with everyone, not just the players, but the fans and going to games. I was there at Wembley for the cup final. That's one of the best days of my life. Like genuinely, just an incredible day that I look back on with such fondness. And there was this real sense last season that we're just all in this together. We're with this team. The fans are with each other together. We have the Jurgen Klopp song, there's the Jota song, all of these things. Just, I always feel like when we have a good season, there are these songs that come out and everything just feels full of life. And this season, that collective identity, that belief, that joy that we always want to feel as Liverpool fans hasn't been there. In terms of the players on the pitch, there's been a real identity crisis. I haven't known what to expect from Liverpool from week to week. We haven't pressed well enough. We haven't, at times attacked well enough, and it's just all felt disjointed and not really fun. And the players haven't looked like they've enjoyed playing with each other this season. So that's what I found really, really tough. But I want to end on an optimistic note because I do think there are signs of life, and I think while we have seen for most of the season, I would say for 3/4 of the season, a team that hasn't looked like a Jurgen Klopp team, a team that hasn't enjoyed playing with one another, and a team that hasn't had a clear sense of identity. I do think that, we said farewell to quite a few players who've been integral, Firmino, Milner, Chamberlain at some points and Keita at some points. But I think we can also say hello to maybe a new kind of growing leadership group in the squad and some players that I think are going to be really important for us moving forward. I think Trent's someone that has really, in terms of just his ability on the ball, but it also some of the stuff he's doing off the pitch. I mean, the academy thing he's doing off the pitch, that's a remarkable intervention by a young footballer. And I do feel like while we're saying goodbye to some really important leaders, and you can say whatever you want about James Milner and the fact that he's been at the club for so long, and some people on Twitter especially had a real problem with that, but he was a leader. You look at what everyone says about him after he's left the club, he was a leader. But while we're saying goodbye to him, I think we are going to say hello to a new version of Trent Alexander-Arnold. Trent Alexander-Arnold will be 25 come the end of this year. And I think, from this season on, the new season we're going to enter, he's going to be one of our leaders. He already is a leader, has been a leader for us for a number of years in terms of a technical leader on the pitch. But I think we're going to see a lot of the off-the-pitch stuff, lots of the stuff we see from Henderson at times, we're going to see from him. And on the pitch, I think he'll become a more commanding figure. So I think there are reasons to be hopeful moving into next season. I think Cody Gakpo, it's gone under the radar a bit, really, but he scored 7 goals this season. That's a fairly healthy return for a player who joined a very disjointed side, played out on the left, didn't look comfortable, then finally played in this false 9 position is really, really good. So we're looking at, him potentially being a key figure next season, Trent becoming more of a leader. Someone like Robertson, I think, will become more of a leader. He'll enter that leadership group that we have. So I do feel optimistic about next season, and I feel optimistic about, the players we're linked to. McAllister looks like he'll be done at some point soon, and maybe Thuram and a few of the others that we'll be linked to. So I do feel a sense of optimism to end the season, but it's been the most un-Jurgen Klopp Liverpool season of our lives, and I hope this is the only one we have between now and 2026, because I just want to have fun, Neil. Winning the league's important, it is, but I want to have fun. I want to be doing post-match pods and tour lives where I'm, just enjoying it. This season, so many times I haven't had fun. I haven't, wanted to talk about Liverpool. I wanted to talk about everything but Liverpool, and I just want to have fun next season. I do think that that's fundamental for us as Liverpool fans. The journey. People often scoff at the journey. The Champions League final 2018, where we didn't win the final, obviously, the journey was so much fun, and we can't forget that. We can't forget the days we had against Roma and City and those games. And I hope the next season, look, I want to win a lot next season. I'm very much on the quadruple train right now as we speak. But I want to have fun. I want to be on a journey next season where, come April, come May, we're doing tour lives, we're doing podcasts where we're thinking about what we're going to do, how we're going to rest players to keep them fresh for these big games we have coming up. That's where I want to be next season. I just want to have fun. I really do believe that although we said farewell to some key players, although we've had this weird season where we haven't quite had an identity up until the last 10 games, I do feel hopeful that next season, with the signs we saw towards the back end of this season, we'll have a lot more fun.
Okay. Mo?
Yeah, I'm 100% on the fun train. And I do think this season, that's one of the main things I've lacked. And it's strange because I look at it from a personal perspective. Last season, I actually managed to make it to more games than I'd have ever done in a season in my life. And this season was probably one of the lowest totals I've had for about 10 years. And I don't know if we've been crap because I've not been there. Let me just say it out there now. But it's kind of added to that feeling of kind of displacement and not unease with what I'm doing. And you're right. The fun hasn't been there, and even the moments that have been fun, like I wasn't at the Newcastle game. I was at the Bournemouth 9-0, which was kind of fun, but now I'm looking back on very differently, and it's almost like the fun of that moment has been ruined. You know, I wasn't at the Man United game as well, but what I do have from that is then the memory that I will take with me forever is walking into the Anfield Wrap office the day after, literally not saying anything, just looking at Craig and then just going, yeah, and just running up and giving him a hug and doing that to about 6 different people, like not even having to say anything, just giving them a hug. And that moment of joy, unbridled joy of like what football can do, that's the only time I really felt it all season. And I need more than one.
That, for me though, Mike, you've very much put that about us. I sort of see that in them. And I think that's the sort of the key knock. And, you know, when it all goes badly wrong in the trenches, in those sort of the really weird middle months of the season. And what I mean by that is the middle months of the season are half of November, a slither of December, and all of January. They are the middle months of the season in the way in which in other seasons they are different. And I think part of that sort of gives it the whole thing a bit of a lack of reality, is that they just looked like they want to be anywhere but on the pitch. I mean, that's my big thing with Brighton away was I've not seen I've seen Jurgen Klopp teams get beat. I've seen them get whacked. I don't think I've ever seen 90 minutes where, well, certainly 75 minutes until he makes some subs, where I've just thought nobody wants to be on this pitch. There's Fabinho's mad 10 minutes at Brighton away in the Cup, where it looked like his teammates were looking at each other like, can we all just pretend he's not there? Because we can't be dealing with this. I've got enough on my plate. And now there's this, like, I loved when the Brighton supporters and some of the media afterwards were like, Liverpool got away with one there. Fabinho should have been sent off. And I was like, if he'd have been sent off, we'd have got a replay. Yeah, it would only have helped the cause. But seeing them in those moments is so like 5-2 against Real Madrid. I'm sort of like, that makes sense to me, even though it's mad and it shouldn't happen, because at least there's periods in that game, and especially at the start, where they look like this is it, where Liverpool were playing football and were enjoying every minute of it. There's so many games where I was watching them and they just look like they wanted to be anywhere else, and I think they've got to fix that as well. That's not just us; that's them too.
Yeah, and I think that comes down to maybe your point from earlier about just these new players bringing a new lease of life. And I think players like new players, good players joining them, you know, so I think they'll be energized by McAllister coming through, and hopefully one or two of the French lads that we've been linked to coming through as well, because they understand their quality and they understand that they need help. You know, they need a new lease of life. And I think the club and the players understand where they are in terms of, they said farewell to some of these key players like Milner, Firmino and Chamberlain, and there is a new Jurgen Klopp side that's going to be built over the summer. So I think that's going to help energize us, and I just hope that the players and us can go back to having fun, because that's ultimately what it's all about.
Okay then. Thank you very much to Mo and to Mike. Neil had to make a move. He would like to be clear, he wasn't being rude. He will listen back to what Mike has said in his own time and go from there. Thanks to JP for speaking to Harriet and Callum for speaking to me. As I said, my interview with Callum that I've already done is going to be on Tour Player next week. This week, last 2 weeks on the Anfield Wrap subscription service, there's been a phenomenal number of really, really good shows about Liverpool's transfers and transfer targets, and also in there as well, excellent stuff with Stephen Gerrard and Curtis Jones, for example, Jamie Carragher and other people as well. It is a fantastic time to subscribe to the Anfield Wrap. You can see all of that stuff. Fantastic stuff about Thuram and Kone, and there will be more of it as more players are linked across the next few days. It is going to be all go. We're doing our transfer committee shows as well at the moment. Mike's just been on one of them. There's another couple of them happening tomorrow. All the way through, loads and loads of bits and pieces coming out next week as well. Lots and lots of stuff about the summer, about the way in which it's going to go next. And maybe, just maybe, Mike will be right and the fun will most definitely return. That's been so live. It's been a belter. Thanks for your comment.